interesting movie is that it has multiple themes running through it.
Right.
You know, one of my reactions, for example, as I'm just watching this, is that you know, I wrote gender narratives versus other narratives. Love stories are usually gender narratives. You know, the first song, the movie begins with the song "When a Man Loves a Woman," and ends with the song "Stand by Your Man." So the interesting thing about the movie, you know, so the traditional love story is encapsulated through the notion of, you know, boy finds girl, boy loses girl, you know, boy regains girl, and in that regard, it had that certain aspect of a traditional love story. But I guess there were several other storylines running through this: war, politics, injustice, race, youth versus aging. All of that was, you know, in there as well, and all these threads are going on all at the same time, which makes it a very complicated movie. And I think that's really why I think the notion that to reduce it simply to a love story is, I think, to do injustice to the complexity, which is the same thing as saying to reduce all human affairs to issues of gender, which we tend to do, is also problematic. Because one of the things that really I think that we have to think about is that gender is just one narrative among many narratives, although it is one of the most powerful narratives. And in the traditions of psychoanalysis, for better or for worse, these narratives have been exalted above others. And those in the room who have read any Freud, you know, for Freud there was sex, which was conflated with gender, and there was aggression. And those were the basic building blocks of human instinct. And everything else is some elaboration of those. Later analysts don't buy that. We don't really think everything boils down to sex and aggression, but sex and aggression are powerful things in human life and in human history. So, see, that's all in there, right?
Well, I think there's
a paper in here. Go ahead.
Another thing that struck me, though, you know, I think it's 1992. The exploration of gender at the time was groundbreaking. Now I found it slightly dated, and I actually found the irony a little bit heavy-handed. But one thing that struck me about it, though not to detract from what it was at that time, one thing that really struck me was the trauma dissociation narrative. That there were so many different layers of both willful, conscious subterfuge or, you know, pretending, and so much sort of unconscious, not articulated to oneself layers of deception. So, for example, there was the gender and how that played out on so many different dimensions, but there was also that he was letting people believe he was Scottish and not Irish. And I was thinking during the movie, like, English people don't know what an Irish accent sounds like. And I had a little trouble sort of believing that, but I was attentive to that idea that he was sort of in disguise as a Scotsman, but he's really Irish.
See, I thought the plot device there was that they were saying that Dill is so removed from issues of politics and ethnicity, and these are not the things that she's concerned about, that she doesn't know the difference between a Scottish and an Irish accent herself. It's of no consequence to her. And in terms of issues of, you know, for example, you know, the choice to use actors of color, for example, you know, as representatives of the Brits is a fascinating choice, because in a way you're saying, you know, here at this moment, you know, the IRA is fighting what they experience as the British colonization of Northern Ireland, and the people doing the fighting are mercenaries who are the children, you know, from ex-colonies who are you know, brought into the scene. And so there's also, so for us Americans who don't know much about English history, there are numerous, you know, references going on there about the relationship of the British Empire to its former and present colonies. You know, so there's another layer, you know, the layer of race and nationalism, colonialism, injustice. Again, we'll get back to that. So again, the film is working on many, many different levels, not just gender, although the gender issue in 1992 was the most sensational aspect of the film. So, from a historical perspective, having just done a review of the literature, because for the DSM-5 work group on gender and sexual identity disorders, the 90s is a time when openly trans people are starting to come out. Separate from this issue, you're beginning to get the kinds of writers who are now identifying not as conventional man or woman, but as trans. This is sort of pre that idea, because here, she feels herself to be a woman, he insists that she's a man. The category of trans doesn't even really come up in a way that might come up, 20 years later, because the culture has changed.
So the dichotomy was still like there in at this era. The dichotomy between like man or woman, white or black, was still there.
Well, for our psychiatric audience here, we need to understand, that the history of transsexualism is a history in which people were expected to transition from one sex to another and then blend into the general population. That was the end point of the whole procedure. The idea was that you would then be, no longer be, you would not be trans, you would be either male, one or the other, because there were only two. And if you presented any symptoms or any psychopathology, or in quotation marks, that meant that you might not make such an adaptation, you were not a candidate for transition. So many people who would lie, for example, to get treatment. Or, as the film demonstrates, there are subcultures where these issues don't matter, where psychiatrists have no say whatsoever. That here you have a world where of people who are performing as transgender publicly, that male to female, and you're having ostensibly men coming to meet women. The whole notion is, and we still have these kinds of cultural situations all over the world, there are public places where men who identify as men go to meet women who might be more ambiguous in their gender presentations.
She's also like an oppressed woman.
I'm sorry?
She's also an oppressed woman who seems very traumatized and possibly abused.
Possibly.
And I wonder if the pills she's taking are somehow hormonal.
Well, it wasn't clear if they were her hormones or her nerve pills.
Exactly. Whether it was a mental issue or
Right. It wasn't clear.
But the other issue is the theme of commitment. I don't have to kind of comment on that. It was like his commitment to his party. He knew that being part of a party that kills people, it's something wrong. But it's an ideology that he was committed to. And then even when he decided to leave them, he kind of didn't, he didn't tell people that he was and actually that's why I think part of it, when he said he's Scottish, he didn't want to betray his party. But at the same time, they were the commitment of his feelings, because he loved this woman, and after that, he realized that physiologically she's a man, and at the same time he want to back up, but at the same time he wants to be faithful to his feelings and to his love.
Well, this is if you're going to tell, is this Fergus's story or is this Dill's story? I think it's Fergus's story, really, the movie. So if it's his story, it's an evolution of his character from a certain set of belief systems into another set of belief systems. And the question is, which is raised very early on in the story of the scorpion and the frog.
Right. Yeah.
Is this about nature or environment? That is, a question with which psychoanalysts have, struggled for many years. In my opinion, overemphasizing nurture over nature. But nevertheless, this is the question: is he the same person at the end that he was at the beginning? Or has something changed in him? And if something has changed, what is nature and what is environmental? And that's a question that we need to think about, I think, as therapists. Because what are we doing with our patients? Are we changing their inner selves, or are we changing, or do they have an inner self that can be changed? I don't know the answer to that question in most situations, but it's a reasonable question to ask. You know, what is our role in the process of providing therapy to a stranger